So hopefully in that little video you've picked up on some of the things that we've been talking about as we've watched this chick flick together. If you haven't been here, you're coming in at the end of the movie, which is always an uncomfortable place to be. When you're coming in, you don't know what's been going on in the movie, so I'm going to try and catch you up real quick. Don't worry about coming in at the end of the movie and needing to be caught up. Half the people here have been here and they've been listening anyway, so they need to be caught up, so it's fine. We're watching a chick flick together, like I said. It's in the book of Ruth in the Bible. So if you have a Bible, the easiest way to find it is to use the table of contents because it's a super small book. Otherwise, it's the 8th, I think, book of the Bible. If you want to flip and find it, you can do that. If you don't have a Bible, there's some Bibles in the back. You're welcome to grab one. You can even take it home with you. We'd love to give you that as a gift. If you got a digital device, it's even easier. You just push Bible and then Ruth, and you're there. So while you're finding the book of Ruth, I want to catch you up. Ruth is only 4 chapters long. Like I said, it's a really short chick flick. But in the first chapter, we were introduced to this guy, Elimelech, and his family, his wife Naomi, and their 2 sons. And things were not going well where they lived, so they left. They went to this other land called Moab. In Moab, Elimelech and both of his sons die. Naomi, the wife, returns with one of her daughters-in-law, Ruth, comes with her back to Bethlehem. And then in chapter 2, we saw that Ruth was providing for both of them. She's been working in the field, doing the only thing that a widowed woman can do in that society, which is basically just picking up scraps that are dropped by the harvesters. And it's at that time that we meet Boaz, the guy that owns the field. He comes out and he asks one of his supervisors, who's that foreign girl over there? She's not from around here. And they explain it to her, and so they've been interacting for 7 weeks throughout harvest, and Ruth decides it's time to act based on Naomi's advice. So in chapter 3, we saw Naomi send Ruth to Boaz to appeal to him as their family redeemer. It was this really weird concept that we talked about a couple weeks ago. You can check it out online if you want to understand the whole guardian redeemer thing, but essentially somebody in the family at that time, because of the way they did land transactions, because of the importance of carrying on a family name, somebody in that family could be known as a redeemer, and there could be more than one redeemer, and those people could buy back land that had been tragically lost. They could buy people out of slavery when they'd been tragically in financial slavery. It's not slavery like we think of today, but they could pull them out of slavery, and they could also marry a widow of a family member to carry on that family member's name. And Boaz agrees to redeem her. However, there's a problem. This is where we left off last time. There was a problem. There's a redeemer that's closer to her in the line. There's somebody in front of him in line. And he says, look, if we're going to do this, we're going to do it the right way. He's got to have the opportunity to do it first. And if he chooses not to, then I'll do it. But we're going to do it right. We need to ask him first. Now, remember, there are some disgraceful ways. Sometimes this is considered an obligation. If you were here, we talked about this is not an obligation. But it is an honorable thing to do, to be a redeemer. So Ruth heads home, and her and Naomi have been waiting. This meeting took place in the middle of the night, and I don't think Boaz probably has slept. I think he's probably been up and this has been turning in his mind. How am I going to make this happen? How is this going to work? And dawn is too late to get to where he needs to go. By the time the sun comes up, the marketplace is already set up. People are already doing their thing. He realizes, I got to get a move on this. So our scene opens up just before dawn as Boaz heads out of the house. And we're in Ruth chapter 4, verse 1. Meanwhile, Boaz went up to the town gate and sat down there just as the guardian redeemer he had mentioned came along. Boaz said, "Come over here, my friend, and sit down." So he went over and sat down. Boaz took 10 of the elders of the town and said, "Sit here." And they did so. Then he said to the guardian redeemer, "Naomi, who has come back from Moab, is selling the piece of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. I thought I should bring the matter to your attention and suggest that you buy it in the presence of these seated here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, do so. But if you will not, tell me, so I will know. For no one has the right to do it except you, and I am next in line." Boaz gets up and he goes to the town gate, the place of business. This is where transactions happen. It serves sometimes even as a courtroom, essentially, in these towns. And so this is where, if you're going to buy and sell property, if you're going to do anything legal, this is where it has to happen, at the town gate. And he knows exactly when and where this man's going to be. And so he gets there and he says, hey, buddy, why don't you come over here? And then he grabs some elders because he says, we need witnesses to make this legal. And you notice that he presents it simply as a land transaction. There's simply a land transaction going on. Elimelech and his family left. They went to Moab. That means they had to abandon their land for a while. They haven't been around, so that land is going to be gone. But you could redeem it for our family. And that's a good thing to do. You can buy it back. And remember, in that time, land is not easy to come by, especially in this area. God divided up, when the Israelites moved into the promised land, God divided up the land for all the people. And they have their piece. So getting a new piece of land is very, very difficult in this time. So it's a great opportunity. Boaz says, hey, look, you can buy this land back for our family, and if you don't want it, I'll take it. In other words, this is a good deal. You might want to jump at this. And I imagine, it doesn't say it here, but I imagine as all this is going on, Ruth and Naomi are somewhere in the crowd. They're peeking. Maybe they got their heads covered so nobody sees them. I don't know. But they're there. If a transaction is going to take place regarding your land, you're going to be there. But they know this represents something so much more. And so Boaz presents it, and verse 4 ends. He says, for no one has the right to do it except you, and I am next in line. And the other guy says, I will redeem it. And I imagine Ruth and Naomi's hearts just sink. This is not what they were wanting to happen. Because they knew if he was going to redeem the land, that meant he got everything that goes with it. That means it's going to be this guy who marries Ruth. This guy that she doesn't really know. This guy that they don't really have a connection with. Things had seemed to be going so well with Boaz, and now it seems like all hope is lost. You can almost hear Ruth's insides just screaming, no. But as the camera turns away from him and back to Boaz, you see just a little smirk on his face. He anticipated this. And so he continues in verse 5. Then Boaz said, on the day you buy the land from Naomi, you also acquire Ruth, the Moabite, the dead man's widow, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property. Remember, we kind of talked about this when we talked about that redeeming thing. The idea was when a guy died without a son to take over and carry on his name, the Redeemer could wed that woman, and the first son would be named after the dead man to carry on his name and take his inheritance, to have his portion and to continue their history. And so Boaz says, oh, by the way, you get the land, you got to take care of Naomi too, because she's still there. And I know she's past childbearing age, but you remember this girl Ruth from Moab? Remember, he points her out as Ruth the Moabite, because if you were here in week 1, we learned that the people from Moab and the people from Israel generally did not get along, and they were not highly esteemed, and Moab were the Satan worshipers. So, oh yeah, when you take this land, not only do you have to take care of Naomi, but you remember that Satan worshiper that came to town? Yeah, that's Elimelech's widow. You got to marry her, and you got to have some kids so that you can carry on Elimelech's name. And I imagine he is completely caught off guard at this. And I imagine he stammers a little bit. Well, what now? I thought we were talking about land. Land is an easy decision. This is a lot more responsibility. And so he responds. At this, the guardian redeemer said, then I cannot redeem it, because I might endanger my own estate. You redeem it yourself. I cannot do it. Chances are, he's probably married already himself. And he probably already has sons from the way he speaks here. So nobody at home is going to be thrilled with this decision. Nobody's going to approve of this action. If you were here during the Bible for Grown-Up series, you might have remembered Andy Stanley giving us the phrase, if you have a favorite wife, things won't go well in your life. It's not against the law for them to take a second wife, but it's not a good idea. It's not what God intended. And he recognizes, Mama ain't going to be happy if I bring home a new girlfriend. And my sons ain't going to be happy if they have to split up their inheritance. They already know what they're getting. He's not a bad guy. This is not dishonorable in this case. He's just a wise guy. Not in the smart aleck sense, but in the intelligence. He's very wise. He gets that this is not going to be a good decision. And you know what? If you're willing to redeem it, it's probably just best if you do it. So he says, you redeem it yourself. And I bet it's nearly impossible for Ruth and Naomi to hide their excitement. This was the outcome they were hoping for when they came to the gate. But they know it still needs to be made official. And so as two men get ready to sign the documents, they're going to open escrow on the land, right? They're going to sign the marriage certificate. But things are a little different in 1300 BC. So the narrator explains for us a little bit. Verse 7. Now in earlier times in Israel, for the redemption and transfer of property to become final, one party took off his sandal and gave it to the other. This was the method of legalizing transactions in Israel. So the guardian redeemer said to Boaz, "Buy it yourself." And he removed his sandal. Then Boaz announced to the elders and all the people, "Today you are witnesses that I have bought from Naomi all the property of Elimelech, Chilion, and Mahlon." Those were his sons, Elimelech's sons. "I have also acquired Ruth the Moabite, Mahlon's widow, as my wife, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property, so that his name will not disappear from among his family or from his hometown. Today you are witnesses." So the other redeemer gives him the official permission. He takes off the sandal, which is weird, but there's this whole thing back in Deuteronomy. You can look it up yourself. It's kind of a weird thing. There's spitting going on at people when it's dishonorable. It's crazy how they did things. I think we ought to bring it back, but that's a whole nother story as to how this is done. So they make it official, and Boaz announces. He gets loud. He's in the town square, and he says, "Just so you know, you guys are all my witnesses." He's standing up in front at his wedding and saying, "I got witnesses. This is going to be my wife. You all hold me to it. You all tell everybody else. This is going to be my land. This is going to be my wife." And he announces it publicly, but because all the town elders are gathered there too, it not only is public, but it's legal. He signs the certificate. He registers with the government, if you will. He does it publicly and legally. He does it the right way. And the crowd gathered around cheers. They're excited about this. Verse 11 says, "Then the elders and all the people at the gate said, 'We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the family of Israel. May you have standing in Ephratah or something, and be famous in Bethlehem. Through the offspring the Lord gives you by this young woman, may your family be like that of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah." And this is the script the people were hoping for. If you were here, you remember we talked about the people loved the character of Boaz and Ruth. These were two very well-liked people in this community. And I think everybody else could see that there was something special between them as well. And so while this seems kind of weird to us, they are praying a great blessing over the wedding of this couple. That they say, we want her to be like Rachel or Leah. Rachel and Leah, between them, had 13 children. 13 sons, I should say. They were considered the mothers of Israel. The sons that they bore became the tribes of Israel. One of those sons, his name was Judah. And Perez was an interesting story because Judah, the tribe that they belonged to, had sons. One of his sons was named Perez. And so that branch of the tribe of Judah became the Perizzite clan. It's the common ancestor that all of these people that are here in this scene have together. And so they're saying, we want you to have numerous offspring. We hope you are well blessed. We hope that things go great for your family and that it continues a long line after you. And this is exactly what they want. They want the happily ever after, right? And we know that it's not always happily ever after. Even when the situation works out like we want it, there's going to be some struggles. But like any good chick flick, we got to end on a positive note, right? So it continues. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. When he made love to her, the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. The women said to Naomi, "Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons has given him birth." Then Naomi took the child in her arms and cared for him. The women living there said, "Naomi has a son," and they named him Obed. Boaz and Ruth knew that God had blessed them with a baby. Children were not taken for granted back in that day. The infant mortality rate was high. They didn't have the science at the time to be able to know why conception didn't happen, if it didn't happen. So they knew that, man, the only way this is going to work is if God blesses us. But they're not the only ones celebrating. The women in the town are rejoicing with Naomi. I don't know if Boaz walks out with Obed and holds him up like the Lion King and starts singing or what have, but everybody is excited because they recognize God's blessing on Naomi, the one who way back in chapter 1 started this whole saga with her return to Bethlehem. They knew how she returned. They knew how bitter she was and how miserable she was. And they see this great blessing show up. They know that she now gets to be a nurse for her grandson. She gets to take care of her own grandbaby. And he's going to make her famous in Israel. So famous, in fact, that 1,200 years later, 1,300 years later, we're watching her movie. And so in honor of all 3 characters, Naomi, Boaz, and Ruth, they named the child Obed, which means servant of God, because we've seen how well they've served throughout the movie. And the screen fades to black as the town celebrates. What a story. I think there's some pollen in here. I don't know if that happens in the winter, but don't tell anybody I cried at a chick flick. This is a good story. It's the best chick flick I've seen, but it's not just in here for its entertainment value. There is some major truth in this story. We've seen it all along, and there's way too many things to cover today, but I want to try and hit at least a few of them. And the first thing I want you to notice in this last chapter here is that sometimes God is going to use you to answer your own prayer. I'll explain that. Sometimes he's going to use you to answer your own prayer. Do you remember the prayer of Boaz in chapter 2? Anybody that was here in chapter 2? He said, he essentially was praying this over Ruth. He said, "May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." You're under God's protection, so may he reward you greatly and richly and provide and protect. And it turns out Boaz is the reward for her commitment to God. Boaz is her protection and becomes her provision. Boaz said, "I want God to make sure that you're taken care of." And God said, "Oh, Boaz, don't worry, I'm going to make sure she's taken care of. And I'm going to use you to do it." When you pray for people, do you use, "Hey, I'll be praying for you"? Do you use that as a way to just get people off your back? To just get rid of them? Or are you ready to be the answer to that prayer? Because I'm going to tell you this morning, not every situation is your responsibility to handle. Not everything that somebody brings to you is your responsibility to fix. You can pray over every situation. Not every situation is yours to take responsibility for. But if no situation is ever your situation to take responsibility for, then there's a problem. Sometimes God brings those people to us not just to pray for them, but to also be able to do something for them. Not every time, but if it's never, something's wrong. Are you looking for an opportunity for God to use you to answer your own prayer? The second thing that I got out of this story, and I think we all need to hear this one, not every story has a happy ending. We know that this seems pretty happy, but we know that there's going to be some struggles in the future. And not every story ends this way. But God is in control no matter the circumstance. We've seen that throughout this entire movie. We've seen when things looked low and God took over. When chaos seems to rule, it helps us to remember that God is in control. When the marriage is in the rocks, we have to know that God is in control. When our finances have bottomed out, we got to know that God is in control. When it seems like death is at the doorstep, God is still in control. I'm not suggesting this morning that He causes every one of those things to happen. But I am suggesting that He's not surprised by it. And He's still working for the good of those who love Him. But often for our part, it's only possible or only likely that we'll see it in the rearview mirror. That's what we saw all along throughout this movie. When all hope seemed lost in Moab, when the husband had died, when the sons had died, God had brought Ruth to Naomi. And Ruth stuck with her and helped provide for her when she wouldn't have been able to provide for herself. When it seemed like Ruth was giving up everything to come back and be with Naomi because there was no hope for her to be married in Israel, God put her in the field of a guy named Boaz, knowing exactly what was going to happen when he started taking care of her. When there was another redeemer in line ahead of Boaz, God gave Boaz the wisdom to handle the situation. And when it seemed like Ruth was barren, remember, she'd been married. We don't know exactly how long, but it was a while at least. And not only did she have no sons to carry on her husband's name, it says she had no children. And it's suggested by the way that goes in chapter 4 when it says that God enabled her to conceive, that everybody had kind of given up hope that she would even have a child. And yet along comes Obed because God provided a child. And that brings me to one of the last things that I pull out of this story is that we can't judge what God is up to until He's done. Unfortunately, at least until today, God hasn't started listening to me when it comes to the best timing on things. I don't know if He listens to you any better than He does to me, but one of these days He's going to figure out that I know what I'm talking about, and He's going to. But until then, I don't really understand His timing sometimes. And I think He's already gotten done working, and the result isn't what I wanted. I don't really know when He's done. And I can't judge what He's up to until He's finished because I'm probably only going to see His hand in the rearview mirror. This entire story, this whole movie that we've watched is full of setbacks. And yet we find out at the end of the story that God was working the whole time, even when the characters couldn't see it. Remember, this was years in these short 4 chapters that we covered. But when they look back, oh, how God was working. In fact, one of the promises that Jesus makes to His followers is this: in this world you will have trouble. See you later. Good luck with that. No, He promises us, in this world you're going to have trouble. Jesus never promises to take us out of our circumstances. He never promises to fix the problems. But He does promise us that He's going to be working behind the scenes. He says, take heart. I have overcome the world. You're not going to get it sometimes. You're not going to understand it. You're going to think your way is better, maybe even most often. But if you'll trust me, I'm working, and I've already overcome this stuff, and I'll get you to the other side of it. And the story of Ruth says, don't give up on God before He's finished. It's one of the reasons that this is one of the best stories, I think, in the entire Bible. This story contains a summary of every other story in the Bible. Chapter 1 talks about tough circumstances. It shows us when life gets tough and it seems like there is no hope. Our journey back, our journey toward God starts with a step of obedience in His direction. We have to get honest about where we are. We have to stop doing things our way and go back to Him. Instead of running from God, we need to go to God. And as it turns out, when Jesus showed up on the scene, the very first thing He talked about is repentance. It's a fancy word to say, turn around. Stop doing what you're doing and do it this way. Chapters 2 and 3 talked about the attitude of obedience in our daily life. Talked about the need for consistency and doing things the right way. When we take this beyond Sunday morning, when it becomes part of our daily life, eventually, step by step, our life starts to look different. When Naomi came back, she was bitter, and she thought that God was against her. And the more they continued to take steps, and the more they continued to be obedient, and the more they continued to press into God instead of running away, her life started to look different. They didn't cut corners. If it was worth doing, it was worth doing right. And this is where we spend the bulk of our life. Are we going to cut corners and do things our way, what we think is best? Or are we going to be obedient and take those small steps, a little bit of time, and stay consistent? Because I'll tell you, a lot of us get the idea when we look at people and we see people who have been successful, whether that's in the business world, whether that's in their marriage, whether that's spiritually, whatever it is, we think everything just worked out for them, that they caught their lucky breaks, and that a few big things happened to get them there. But most of those stories are not the case. We hear of one every now and then, but for most of them, regardless of what the situation of success has been, it's been small steps and consistent steps moving in the same direction over a long, long period of time. That's going to get you way further in life than a few big leaps. And chapter 3 showed us that. They did things right, and they stayed consistent. And that brought them to chapter 4, where they could look back and see God's hand in the rear view, where they could see that God had been working the whole time, even when it didn't seem like it, even as they took their little steps. And they're able to look back on life joyfully. Naomi is able to look back on the events and know that there was struggle and hardship, but seeing how God had worked in her life, she's able to look back with joy on the life that she's lived. And that's what ends up leading to the legacy that we leave behind. What kind of legacy do you want to leave behind? I want a legacy like that, like Naomi. And they get well wishes from the town. Things are going great right now. They know things are going to get tough, but these are two people that do things right. Things are going to go well for you. And so what kind of legacy did they leave? Well, as it turns out, the story isn't quite over. If you were following along on your personal flat screen, you noticed that there were a few more verses that we didn't touch. Anybody watch the Avengers? Avengers fans? If you've ever watched the Avengers or any like the planned trilogies where they show the first movie, but you know there's already a couple more in the works, you know the trick that they pull now. You got to watch the credits. You got to stick around because there's a hidden scene somewhere in the middle there. There's something that gives you a clue about what's coming next. So as we finish up our chick flick and you start to grab your trash and your coat, the credits start to roll. This then is the family line of Perez. Perez was the father of Hezron, Hezron the father of Ram, Ram the father of Amminadab, Amminadab the father of Nahshon, Nahshon the father of Salmon, Salmon, the father of Boaz, Boaz, the father of Obed, and then here comes the hidden scene. Check this out. I'll go all the way to the end one, to verse 22. Sorry, I screwed that up when I put it in there. Obed, the father of Jesse, Jesse, the father of David. If you're familiar with the franchise, if you've already read the comic books, if you're a professional Christian, you get really excited at that because you know where this story is going. If you're not familiar, that's fine. I want to give you a little sneak peek of the next big trailer. It starts the book of Matthew. This is the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. The marriage of Ruth and Boaz leads to Jesus. The marriage of Ruth and Boaz is going to be the way that God provides the Messiah for the world. And there's going to be 4 movies about this Jesus guy called Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And I don't care whether you follow Jesus or whether you don't follow him, you owe it to yourself, if you're going to make up your mind about whether or not to follow him, to check these movies out for yourself. Don't take an online review. Go watch them yourself. They're awesome stories. But here's the deal. Ruth wasn't thinking about the next movie. She was excited to have a son. She was excited to know that Obed was going to do something incredible, hopefully. She had no idea that this was coming down the line. This is simply the way God brought about the Savior. Through the obedience of 2 people. Through small, consistent steps, not cutting corners, not giving up when things got tough. And God used their story to change the world. So I want to ask you this morning, what can God do through your obedience? You may not ever see it, but what could he do if you made the decision today to be obedient? Let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for the opportunity this morning to study your word together. To know how you want us to live. The fact that you would preserve this for us to know, man, these are the people that got it right. If you want to be like somebody, be like them. God, I don't know where we're all coming from, so I'll speak for myself. But I know I fail at this constantly. This daily, small steps of obedience, I screw it up. And I'm guessing that I'm not the only one in this room. So God, for every one of us that struggles with this, will you help us? Just help us today to make that next decision to say, I'm not going to cut the corners. I'm going to do it the right way. I'm going to do it your way because your way leads to better ways than mine. Even if I don't understand it, even when I can't see it, even when it seems like things are getting worse, I know that your way will ultimately result in the best way, even if I don't get to see it. God, if we've never made that choice, if there's somebody here this morning who has never chosen to follow you, to say, I want your way, God, I pray that you would speak to their heart right now in this moment, that you would remind them of the lengths that you went to, giving your son to die so that we could have a restored relationship because you loved us that much. Remind them how much you love them. Make it very, very real and very tangible in this moment. If that is you in this room, you don't have to do anything out loud. I'm not going to ask you to put a hand up or come forward or anything. I just, right now, between you and God, you can just tell him, hey, I need help. My way isn't working. You just pray this prayer. Say, God, please take over. I give you my life. I want your way, not my way. But know it's going to be a daily decision for all of us. It's a daily decision to obey, to follow. It's something that we don't ultimately get perfect until we've left this earth. So God, help all of us to make those decisions, because we can't even begin to fathom what you can do through the life of one obedient, faithful person, let alone through an entire community of faithfulness and obedience. God, I pray that you let that obedience, you let that faithfulness start today in this room with this group of people. That you would change lives throughout the city, throughout neighborhoods, change families, and bring glory to your name. Through Jesus we pray. Amen.